today what we're building is, I'm putting the finishing touches, I should say, on this dining room wainscoting. It's just something the homeowner sketched out. She came up with the idea and decided to place a shelf at about 62 inches off the ground, and we're not putting panels within the stiles. We're actually just putting this over the plaster, because with it being painted you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference, and there's a tremendous cost saving in doing it this way. We're not sure what to do as far as this electric outlet. We were thinking of putting a arched segment between the two windows and then just stopping this here and just basically make a celebration out of the electric outlet. We're using these little corbel brackets. As nice as they look, one would be just a little bit paltry looking, so what we've decided to do is double them up. That gives a little bit more of a substantial appearance. And then on the end, this is not a full width. If this is a column, this is a pilaster. It's a half column or a half stile. So we're just going to put one of these corbels on the end. You might want to take note of the fact that there's a little channel that runs along the top of the shelf. All of these old bungalows that had this treatment would have had that so that they could display china and what have you. This is a completed portion of it. The plaster is very wavy here. You can see right here it dips in, so the width of the shelf here is quite different than the width of the shelf here than the width of the shelf here. All of these panels on the longer walls have an odd number of panels, and that way there's always something to center on. It's not very costly to do it this way, where you're just going over the plaster versus insetting wooden panels, which would look no different once painted. The finishing touch was this little OG molding that we nailed around the perimeter of the shelf. We really didn't want to come out too far from the wall because we were fearful that somebody would bump their head on that coming around the corner, so it only comes out about 3 1/4 of an inch. The biggest celebration of this room is this division between the living room and the dining room. A lot of times you would see these. They were very common to divide the living room and the dining room with a bookcase and tapered columns supporting a bearing beam. The homeowner opted to continue the columns on down. She did not want a bookcase, so we just made these big pedestals. The columns are really nothing more than plywood. You won't see any end grain of the plywood on this project, as we have laminated a piece of wood onto the edge of each piece of plywood. It's called a core box column. And this is a half column coming off the wall that is known as a pilaster. This was a tricky little piece to fit. I had to cut this profile into the edge of this, and the means by which I accomplished that were just simply by scribing the design and coping it out and fitting it in. The major issue dealing with this project was having to put this ornamental casing around the bearing beam that suspends the second floor. All they had between the living room and the dining room was a little doorway. It certainly wasn't very open. It made you feel closed in. The other problem associated with this were some electrical outlets that were in the wall that had to be put in the casework, such as that triple switch you see over there and a receptacle. There also was a cluster of wires that were in that wall that had to be rerouted into this column. This is a metal plate that lays flat against the column in an inconspicuous place. And if ever there's an electrical issue, the electrician can access the wires that are concealed in this column. And there's also a post that goes all the way to the floor through the center of this column, and that helps support that beam, which, as I said, supports the second floor. It's a typical column. You have a plinth, the column, and the capital. This uppermost portion here is called bed molding. That fits up against what we call an abacus. It's a toned down version. We didn't want to get extremely ornate. That was pretty much the thrust of the movement back in the 1920s. They were trying to get away from all of the fussiness of the Victorian era with all of their snickerdoodle and their intricate filigree inlays and multiple colors. In the 1920s, they wanted simple, straight lines and something that implied solidity. Say it's about high 12. Why don't we take a little break and go out on the porch and have a little chat. Long ago, long before, a long time ago, dust fell from the stars and sifted through the universe, through the ether, and through the stratosphere. And it was gathered by a society whose intellect is so far above the mass of mankind, they slip through our fingers like mercury. They were highly adept at anything they did, so much so that they were a threat to anybody who had notions of tyranny and despotism as far as ruling people, be it civil and political or pastoral and religious. And very often these people had to go conceal themselves to stay out of view. But whenever some impossible task arose, whenever they were needed, they were called upon. And they were highly adept at building. They understood geometry, which meant they understood the phenomena of the universe. They worked for every leader of every civilized country in the world, building bridges, priories, cathedrals, preceptories. Every major work of architecture throughout history up to present day, they had their hands in. Perhaps the highest tribute they offered to the heavens as the great achievements of mankind would have looked something like this. I have here a poster that illustrates the orders of architecture, at least the orders of architecture that we revere here in the Western world. There's many other types of orders of architecture. You might ask yourself, well, how did they place a column perfectly upright? The answer is quite simple. They would simply make a mark in the center of the column, top and bottom, and then they would stand back with a weighted object. This is called a plumb bob, and they would align those two marks with this perfectly vertical string. They would do so from different angles until they got it right. This string is always perfectly plumb. If you come off of the string with a square, you would attain a perfect level. You have plumb, level, and square, and those are the three things that we try to adhere to when building anything. However, when you get into a house like this, a lot of times the house is settled or somebody has raised up one side of it or the other. A lot of these old houses are anything but plumb level and square. This one is pretty well intact, but there are a couple places where the floor dips and I had to make necessary provisions. Had I put it in perfectly level and perfectly plumb, when you walk in the door you might have noticed something was not quite right. So what I did was the correct thing. It might not be the right thing, but it was the correct thing. I just tipped it a little bit out of level. When you're working on these old 20 style houses, quite often you have an occasion to replicate one of these columns. They're really very easy to understand and very easy to build. As I said, I laminated a piece of wood on one side and left the other. They fit together very nicely with these little glue blocks. If you have an extremely wide column, you might want to put a little brace on the inside to keep the plywood from bowing or distorting, but they simply go together in this manner. Of course, you want to glue the corners before you nail it together. On the bottom is a plug that you can insert while you're assembling it so that you can keep it square. The advantage to not completely assembling it is you can place this around a structural post and then put the final piece in to wrap it up. Because a lot of times these columns have to support a great deal of weight. If you have an outside column, something like this would go around the bottom of it. This is for a much smaller column, but you would allow a little provision for water to weep out if it were on a front porch. And something very similar would go around the top, and you would extend it far enough to put some kind of decorative molding underneath. That's about all there is to say about columns today. And I sure thank you for your interest. This is Brian with Historic Woodwork. See you soon. Thus he showed me, and behold, the Lord stood upon a wall made by a plumb line, with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said unto me, Amos, what seest thou? And I said, a plumb line. Then said the Lord, behold, I will set a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will not again pass by them anymore.